What comes to mind when we think of the word nation? Is it a country or a sports team or maybe First Nations? It can be a tricky concept to pin down, and the answer to what a nation is might even surprise you. At the heart of it, a nation is people. So, when we start talking about the concept of a nation, we have an important distinction to make. A country does not necessarily equal a nation, even though often those terms are used interchangeably. What countries are really nation states. And as we'll see, many nations don't actually have their own countries or states to call their own.
All right, so let's break this down. We have three concepts to think about here. First, a nation. Basically, a nation is a large group of people that have a shared connection. Each color here will represent a single nation. A nation state, or what we call a country, is when a nation has total control over their own destiny, or what we call sovereignty. And we'll cover sovereignty in more detail in a future video. This will require defined borders, a government, and recognition by states around the world. Some examples are Japan, Finland, or Egypt. A stateless nation, on the other hand, like our purple example here, is a nation that does not have its own country. And some can be pretty big, like 30 plus million Kurds living in the Middle East, 8.5 million Catalonians living in northern Spain, and 8 million people of Quebec living in Canada, among many, many others around the world. Sometimes they may be entirely within one state, but other times they might spread over several states. Some nations, like the US and Canada, might have national identities of their own, but people who move to these nation states often bring their own national identities with them as well. In fact, through the process of globalization and the movement of people around the world, this is becoming more and more common in more places.
So then what makes people a nation? Well, according to a French philosopher from the 19th century, Ernest Renan, a nation is made up of two things. One is the possession in common of a rich legacy of memories. The other is present-day consent, the desire to live together, the will to perpetuate the value of the heritage that one has received in an undivided form. To have common glories in the past and to have a common will in the present. To have performed great deeds together and to wish to perform still more. These are the essential conditions for being a people. Right? So it's this invisible bond that people share and makes people feel that they have that connection to each other that can bind people into what we might call a nation. A lot of the Western concept of nation dates back to the French Revolution, where before the French Revolution, people basically saw themselves as being subject of a king or a monarchy of some other form. And over the course of the French Revolution, French people began to see themselves as having that invisible bond with each other as citizens of France. And that led them to, for example, execute their king and try to radically reform what the French country and French state looked like. Right? Similar story in the American Revolution, where the people of the colonies that are now in the United States, that were British colonies, saw themselves as being different from British subjects. They didn't see themselves as British anymore. They started to see themselves as American, and so fought for their right to rule themselves as a people. And in fact, the American Constitution starts off with "we the people," right? Seeing themselves as a nation and wanting to rule themselves and not be ruled by a king or a monarch, right? And so there needs to be some form of that collective consciousness where people realize that they do have those connections, they do have those bonds with one another, and that could bind them into being a nation. So then, what do we make of the term nationalism? What does nationalism mean? Well, a nationalism is that desire for a nation to have some control over its own destiny. And different nations might feel this in slightly varying degrees. Nation states, for example, might pursue nationalism through a strong focus on their own national interests that make them stronger, and potentially even disregarding any international obligations they might have. For stateless nations, so nations that see themselves as a national group but maybe don't have that control over their own destiny that they might want, for these stateless nations such as Palestinians, Catalonians, people of Quebec, Kurds, that nationalism might be statehood. In some, like the Indigenous people in Canada and the United States, nationalism and that desire to have control over your own destiny, that might be increased autonomy within that nation state, more self-government. So that might sound all well and good, but what happens when the people of a nation begin to diverge in their definition of their national identity? Say immigrant nations like the United States or Canada, different people might have vastly different ideas of what it means to be American or Canadian. Or what if a nation's pursuit of their power over their own destiny means they pursue national interests that might be to the detriment of others, or in some cases, maybe even the dominance of others. And in the next parts of this series on nationalism, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at first some of the building blocks that help create that national identity and why those things might come into conflict to begin with. And in the third part, we'll look at some of the challenges and conflict brought on by the pursuit of nationalism more broadly. So stay tuned for those and subscribe to make sure that you don't miss any future videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.